In the early morning mist of April 16th, 1746, on the desolate moor of Culloden, two armies faced each other in what would become the bloodiest 40 minutes in Scottish history. On one side stood the exhausted remnants of a Highland army, 5,000 starving clansmen who had marched through hell itself for their rightful king. On the other, 9,000 disciplined Redcoats, their bayonets gleaming, their cannons loaded with grape shot, ready to crush a dream that had burned in Scottish hearts for nearly 60 years. What happened next was not just a battle. It was a massacre so brutal, so complete, that it would forever change the soul of Scotland and earn one man a nickname that still echoes with infamy today: Butcher Cumberland. This is the story of Culloden, the last pitched battle ever fought on British soil, where the ancient clan system met modern warfare and was obliterated in a storm of cannon fire and cold steel. It is the tale of bonny Prince Charlie's desperate gamble, of Highland warriors charging into the face of death, and of a government so determined to crush rebellion that it would attempt to erase an entire culture from existence. By the time the smoke cleared that April morning, more than 1,000 men lay dead in the heather, and with them died the last hope of the House of Stuart. But the killing had only just begun. The roots of this catastrophe stretch back to 1688, when the English Parliament decided it had endured enough of Catholic kings. King James II, a Stuart monarch who had dared to practice his faith openly and favor Catholic appointees, was driven from his throne in what history would politely call the Glorious Revolution. In his place came his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange, ushering in a new era of parliamentary supremacy and religious conformity. But James did not simply fade into exile. He retreated to France, gathering supporters, plotting his return, and passing his claim to his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the man his enemies would mockingly call the Old Pretender. For nearly 60 years, this contest for the British crown simmered like a slow-burning fuse. The Jacobites, named for the Latin form of James, believed with unshakable conviction that the Stuarts were the rightful rulers of Britain. They saw the Hanoverian kings who had succeeded to the throne as usurpers, German princes with no legitimate claim to rule over Scottish clans and English shires. In the Highlands of Scotland, where ancient loyalties ran deeper than lowland politics, this belief took on an almost religious fervor. Clan chiefs, who had sworn oaths to the Stuart kings, felt bound by honor to support their cause, generation after generation. The Highland clans were a world unto themselves, governed by codes of honor that seemed medieval to the merchants of Edinburgh and London. Here, a man's word was his bond, blood debts passed from father to son, and loyalty to one's chief mattered more than life itself. These were not the tamed Scots of the lowlands who had embraced trade and Protestant Reformation. These were warriors who still spoke Gaelic, wore the plaid, and carried the broadsword. When they looked south to the Hanoverian court in London, they saw foreigners ruling over lands their ancestors had bled to defend. Into this powder keg of resentment and ancient loyalty stepped Charles Edward Stuart in the summer of 1745. The young pretender, as his enemies called him, or bonny Prince Charlie to those who loved him, was everything a romantic rebellion needed. Tall, handsome, charismatic, he possessed the kind of magnetic presence that could inspire men to march into cannon fire. Born in Rome, raised in the courts of Europe, he spoke French better than English and had never set foot in the Highlands until he landed on the shores of Eriskay with just 7 companions. Yet within months, this foreign prince would command the loyalty of thousands of Highland warriors and lead them to victories that shook the British government to its core. Charlie's arrival was not met with universal enthusiasm. Even among the clan chiefs who had supported his father's cause, many hesitated. The Old Pretender had already failed twice to reclaim his throne, in 1715 and 1719. Each failed rising had brought savage reprisals from the government, with estates forfeited, chiefs executed, and common clansmen transported to the colonies. The scars of those defeats were still fresh in Highland memory. Why should this attempt prove different? But Charles possessed something his father had always lacked: the ability to inspire men through personal magnetism rather than mere political arguments. When he raised his standard at Glenfinnan in August 1745, and the pipes skirled across the loch, Something ancient stirred in Highland hearts. Here was a prince willing to share their dangers, to sleep rough in the heather, to march beside them rather than behind them. Clan by clan they began to gather. The MacDonalds, the Camerons, the Stuarts, the Macphersons, all the proud names that had echoed through Highland history for centuries. The early victories came with shocking swiftness. At Prestonpans in September, the Highland charge proved unstoppable against government forces unprepared for its ferocity. Redcoats who had trained to fight European armies found themselves facing warriors who fought like their ancestors had at Culloden, screaming Gaelic war cries as they swung broadswords with terrifying skill. The government army crumbled, its commander fled, and suddenly all of Scotland lay open before the Jacobite advance. Edinburgh fell without a siege. The Scottish capital, that proud bastion of Presbyterian respectability, opened its gates to a Catholic pretender backed by Highland savages. In the drawing rooms of the new town, ladies who had never spoken Gaelic found themselves curtsying to clan chiefs whose grandfathers had been branded as outlaws. It was a world turned upside down, and for a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as if the old Scotland might yet triumph over the new. But Charles Edward Stuart had not come to rule Scotland alone. His eyes were fixed on the greater prize, the throne of England itself. Against the advice of his Scottish supporters, he ordered the army south. Through the lowlands they marched, then across the border into England, leaving behind the mountains that had sheltered them and the people who truly understood their cause. Each mile south took them further from their strength and deeper into enemy territory. The march to Derby in late 1745 was perhaps the most audacious gamble in British military history. A Highland army, never numbering more than 6,000 men, penetrated to within 130 miles of London. In the capital, panic reigned. King George II prepared to flee to Hanover. The Bank of England suspended cash payments. For a few terrifying weeks, it seemed as if the impossible might happen, that a handful of Highland warriors might overturn the established order of Britain itself. Yet the gamble failed, not through military defeat but through the cold mathematics of strategic reality. The English Jacobites Charles had counted on did not rise. The French support he had been promised did not materialize. His army, magnificent though it was, remained what it had always been, a Highland host far from home, outnumbered by enemies on every side. At Derby, faced with the prospect of fighting 3 government armies simultaneously, the Council of War voted to retreat. The march back to Scotland was the beginning of the end. Winter closed in, supplies ran short, and with each mile northward, the aura of invincibility that had carried them so far began to fade. They won a final victory at Falkirk in January 1746, but it was a hollow triumph. Government reinforcements were pouring into Scotland, led by a commander who understood Highland warfare better than any of his predecessors. William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, had studied the lessons of Prestonpans and Falkirk. He would not make the same mistakes. The Highland army that gathered on Culloden Moor that fateful April morning was a shadow of the force that had conquered Scotland and invaded England. Hunger had thinned their ranks as much as battle. Many had drifted away to their homes, carrying what plunder they could gather. Those who remained were exhausted, demoralized, and desperately short of supplies. They had attempted a surprise night attack on Cumberland's camp just hours before, but the plan had collapsed when the starving men stopped to search for food in the darkness. Charles, against the advice of his best commanders, chose to make his stand on Culloden Moor, a flat, open expanse that negated every advantage Highland tactics possessed. Here there would be no broken ground to disrupt enemy formations, no cover from artillery fire, no opportunity for the ambush and swift strike that had won so many previous victories. It was ground chosen by a desperate man who had run out of options, and it would prove to be the graveyard of the Jacobite cause. The morning of April 16th dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind cutting across the moor that carried the promise of rain. Cumberland's army had been in position since before sunrise, their red coats forming neat lines across the battlefield, like rows of blood-colored chess pieces. The Duke himself rode among his troops, a stocky figure whose presence radiated confidence and authority. At 25, he was younger than many of his officers, but he possessed something more valuable than experience. He had the absolute backing of his father, King George II, and the resources of the British Empire at his disposal. The government forces were a marvel of 18th century military engineering, 9,000 men arranged in 3 lines, with cavalry on the flanks and artillery, positioned to sweep the field with devastating fire. These were not the hastily assembled militias that had crumbled at Prestonpans. Cumberland had spent months training his soldiers specifically to fight Highland warriors, drilling them in new bayonet techniques designed to counter the feared Highland charge. Where previous commanders had underestimated their enemy, Cumberland had studied them with the cold precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. The artillery was particularly formidable. 10 3-pound cannons and 6 mortars, all under the command of Colonel William Belford, Britain's finest gunner. These weapons had been positioned with mathematical precision to create overlapping fields of fire across the moor. Every yard of ground the Highlanders would have to cross had been measured, marked, and targeted. When the guns opened fire, there would be nowhere to hide. In stark contrast, the Jacobite army presented a picture of desperate improvisation. 5,000 men, perhaps fewer, arranged in the traditional Highland formation with the clans positioned according to ancient precedents and bitter rivalries. The MacDonalds, traditionally given the honor of holding the right wing, had been placed on the left, a slight that would have consequences when the battle began. Their artillery consisted of a dozen mismatched cannons of different calibers, poorly served and inadequately supplied with ammunition. Charles Edward Stuart rode among his men that morning, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. The prince who had charmed the courts of Europe and inspired Highland loyalty now faced the reality of his situation. His army was starving, exhausted, and outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. Many of his best commanders had advised retreat, even surrender, but Charles refused to consider either option. He had gambled everything on this rebellion, and he would see it through to whatever bitter end awaited. The Highland warriors themselves presented a sight that would have been magnificent in better circumstances. Clan tartans and eagle feathers, broadswords and targes, the ancient regalia of Highland warfare displayed for perhaps the last time on a British battlefield. But beneath the proud exterior lay the reality of their condition. Many had not eaten in days, their ammunition was running low, their weapons were worn, and their numbers had been steadily diminishing through desertion and disease. At 11 o'clock in the morning, Cumberland gave the order to begin the bombardment. The government artillery opened with a thunderous roar that echoed across the moor like the voice of an angry god. Round shot and grape shot tore through the Highland ranks, cutting down men where they stood. The Jacobite guns attempted to reply, but their fire was sporadic and largely ineffective. For 30 agonizing minutes, the Highlanders endured this mechanical slaughter, watching their comrades torn apart by iron balls while they could do nothing but wait for the order to advance. The psychological effect of the bombardment was as devastating as the physical damage. Highland warriors were accustomed to close combat, to looking their enemies in the eye before striking them down. This impersonal killing by distant gunners violated every principle of their warrior code. Men who would charge unflinchingly into a forest of bayonets found themselves shaking under the relentless artillery fire. Finally, unable to endure the slaughter any longer, parts of the Highland line began to move forward without orders. The Macintoshes and Macleans on the right wing started the advance, followed reluctantly by other clans. It was not the coordinated assault that might have succeeded, but a ragged, desperate charge by men driven beyond endurance. The Highland charge, that terrifying tactic which had won so many previous victories, met its match on Culloden Moor. As the clansmen surged forward through the smoke and rain, they encountered obstacles their ancestors had never faced. The government troops stood firm in their lines, no longer the frightened recruits who had fled at Prestonpans. Cumberland's drilling had taught them to present a wall of steel that would not break. When the Highlanders reached the government lines, they found themselves facing a new and deadly tactic. Instead of each soldier fighting the man directly in front of him, Cumberland had trained his troops to bayonet the enemy to their right, striking at the unprotected side of each Highland warrior. This simple innovation turned the fearsome Highland charge into a death trap, as clan warriors found themselves impaled on bayonets they never saw coming. The slaughter was horrific and swift. Highlanders who had survived a dozen battles fell in heaps before the government lines. The Macintoshes, who had led the charge, were virtually annihilated. Clan Chattan lost half its strength in minutes. The ground before the Redcoat lines became carpeted with Highland dead, their bright tartans soaked with blood and mud. On the left wing, the MacDonalds, still smarting from their perceived slight in the battle order, hesitated before joining the assault. When they finally advanced, it was too late. The battle was already lost, the Highland centre shattered, and Cumberland's cavalry was beginning to wheel around to attack the flanks. Some MacDonald companies never engaged at all, standing in sullen formation while their kinsmen died before the government guns. Prince Charles, watching from a rise behind his army, saw his dreams crumbling before his eyes. Advisors urged him to flee as the Highland line collapsed, but for long minutes he remained transfixed by the destruction of everything he had worked to achieve. The romantic vision of a restored Stuart monarchy was drowning in Highland blood on the moor of Culloden. As the Highland charge failed and the clans began to break, Cumberland ordered his cavalry forward to complete the destruction. Dragoons swept across the battlefield, cutting down fleeing Highlanders with ruthless efficiency. What had begun as a battle was rapidly becoming a rout, and the rout was turning into a massacre. The fighting, such as it was, lasted less than an hour. When the smoke cleared, over 1,000 Highland warriors lay dead on the moor, while Cumberland's casualties numbered fewer than 50 killed and 300 wounded. It was not just a defeat, but a catastrophe so complete that it effectively ended centuries of Highland military tradition in a single morning. But for the survivors of Culloden, the nightmare was only beginning. Cumberland's reputation for mercy was already questionable, and the forged orders supposedly captured from the Jacobites gave him the excuse he needed for the horrors that would follow. The aftermath of Culloden would prove far more savage than the battle itself. As the Highland army disintegrated and fled across the moor, Cumberland's dragoons pursued them with orders that chilled the blood of even hardened soldiers. The Duke had made his intentions clear to his officers. This rebellion would be crushed so thoroughly that Scotland would never dare rise again. The wounded Highlanders who lay groaning among the heather received no quarter. Government soldiers moved systematically across the battlefield, bayoneting any clansman who showed signs of life. Men who begged for mercy were shot where they lay. Others, attempting to crawl to safety, were clubbed to death with musket butts. The ancient laws of war, which demanded the protection of the wounded and defenseless, meant nothing to Cumberland's troops that day. Among the dead lay not just Highland warriors, but the dreams of an entire people. Clan chiefs who could trace their lineages back to the ancient kings of Scotland breathed their last in the cold mud of Culloden Moor. Young men who had followed their prince with songs on their lips would never see their glen homes again. Fathers and sons, brothers and cousins, entire families had been swept away in that terrible 40 minutes of slaughter. Prince Charles himself barely escaped with his life. As his army collapsed around him, his Irish officers physically dragged him from the field, ignoring his protests that he should die with his men. The prince who had dreamed of ruling 3 kingdoms found himself fleeing across the Highlands like a common fugitive, depending on the loyalty of people he had led to destruction. The hunt for the young pretender became the most intense manhunt in British history. Cumberland placed a bounty of £30,000 on Charles's head, a fortune that could have made any man rich beyond his wildest dreams. Troops scoured every glen and island, searching for the most wanted man in the kingdom. Yet, for 5 months, Charles evaded capture, hidden and protected by Highland folk who had every reason to betray him but chose loyalty over gold. The most famous episode of this desperate flight came through the courage of a young woman named Flora MacDonald. On the island of South Uist, as government ships closed in from every direction, Flora agreed to smuggle Charles to safety disguised as her Irish serving maid, Betty Burke. It was a plan so audacious that it might have been conceived by a romantic novelist, yet it worked. The prince who had once danced in the palaces of Versailles now wore women's clothing and spoke in falsetto, playing the role of a humble servant to escape the dragnet closing around him. The journey to Skye was fraught with peril. Government patrols watched every crossing, and the slightest mistake would have meant death for Charles and disaster for all who helped him. Yet Flora MacDonald, barely 24 years old, guided the disguised prince through waters thick with enemy vessels. Her stepfather commanded the local militia hunting for Charles, Her fiancé served in the government army, yet she risked everything to help a cause that was already lost. The irony was bitter. Flora represented everything the Jacobite cause claimed to fight for, the loyalty and courage of the Scottish people. Yet her bravery could not restore what had been lost at Culloden. Charles would eventually escape to France aboard a frigate, but he carried with him only the hollow title of a king without a kingdom. Behind him, he left a Scotland that would never be the same. Cumberland's soldiers had not been content with their victory on the battlefield. In the weeks and months following Culloden, they embarked on a campaign of terror designed to break the Highland spirit forever. Villages that had harbored Jacobites were burned to the ground. Cattle were slaughtered or driven off, leaving families to face starvation. Any man found carrying arms was shot on sight, and many who carried nothing more dangerous than a dirk for eating were executed as rebels. The atrocities committed in the name of preventing future rebellion shocked even hardened observers. Wounded Jacobites were dragged from their hiding places and murdered in cold blood. Barns filled with injured men were set ablaze, their occupants burned alive. Women and children who had committed no crime beyond belonging to the wrong clan were driven from their homes to wander the hills without shelter or sustenance. Cumberland himself seemed to take pleasure in these brutalities. He toured the Highlands like a conqueror, surveying a defeated province, issuing orders for increasingly harsh measures. His correspondence with London reveals a man convinced that only through terror could Scotland be pacified. The nickname Butcher Cumberland, initially applied by his enemies, began to be whispered even by his own supporters, who were appalled by the scale of the repression. The government in London, initially supportive of Cumberland's harsh methods, soon realized that stronger measures were needed to ensure Highland submission. Military force alone could not guarantee that the clans would never rise again. What was required was nothing less than the destruction of Highland society itself. Parliament moved swiftly to enact laws that would have been unthinkable before Culloden. The Act of Proscription, passed in August 1746, was perhaps the most comprehensive assault on a culture ever attempted by the British state. Highland dress, the visible symbol of clan identity, was banned outright. Any man caught wearing the tartan faced 6 months' imprisonment for a first offence and transportation to the colonies for a second. The kilt, the plaid, the bonnet, all the garments that had made Highland warriors instantly recognizable, were declared illegal. Government agents roamed the glens, searching homes for forbidden clothing and arresting anyone who dared to wear the dress of their ancestors. The very act of looking like a Highlander became a crime punishable by exile from Scotland forever. But the attack on Highland culture went far deeper than mere clothing. The Act of Proscription also banned the carrying of weapons, effectively disarming a people who had always regarded the sword as the mark of a free man. Clan chiefs who had ruled their territories like medieval princes found their ancient powers stripped away by parliamentary decree. The heritable jurisdictions that had allowed them to dispense justice and command absolute loyalty were abolished, replaced by courts answerable only to Edinburgh and London. Even music fell victim to the cultural warfare. Bagpipes, the stirring instrument that had called Highland warriors to battle for centuries, were declared weapons of war and banned accordingly. Pipers caught playing the ancient airs faced the same penalties as men found carrying swords. The very sounds that had echoed across Highland glens since time immemorial were silenced by Act of Parliament. The Gaelic language itself came under assault. Children were forbidden to speak their native tongue in schools, forced instead to learn English if they wished to receive any education at all. Ministers were ordered to preach only in English, cutting off entire communities from religious instruction they could understand. Within a generation, the government hoped Gaelic would disappear entirely, taking with it the oral traditions that preserved Highland history and identity. Perhaps most devastating of all was the seizure of Jacobite estates. Clan lands that had been held by the same families for centuries were confiscated by the crown and sold to the highest bidder. Ancient ties between chief and clan, bonds that had held Highland society together since the dawn of history, were severed by the cold machinery of English law. The blood-soaked moor of Culloden marked more than the end of a battle. It witnessed the death of an entire way of life, the final chapter in a story that had begun with ancient kings and ended with mass graves. In 40 minutes of mechanized slaughter, Cumberland's cannons had accomplished what centuries of English policy could not. They had broken the Highland spirit and scattered the dreams of the House of Stuart to the wind like smoke from a dying fire. The clans would never rise again. Their tartans banned, their language silenced, their chiefs reduced to landlords collecting rent from tenants who had once been warriors. Bonnie Prince Charlie would live out his days in bitter exile, drowning his failures in wine, while the Scotland he had promised to liberate vanished forever beneath the weight of English law and Highland blood.